What's up, everyone? Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane and asks the question, what if? I'm your host, Jim Montgomery. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday, whether it was Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, celebrating no holiday, celebrating all holidays. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed the past week since the last time I spoke with you. Since this is going to be the last time I speak to you before the new year, let me be the first to wish you a very happy, healthy, and prosperous new year. We'll be back with a lot of great things coming up in 2023, so stay tuned for that. Going to start off with our typical state of the Philadelphia sports scene. Phillies obviously have had their great offseason so far. Very quiet this week since although I don't remember whether they signed Craig Kimbrell before or after I recorded, but that's a pretty good deal for them. It's a 1-year, $10 million deal, almost like a prove-it deal for him. Bring some veteran leadership to that bullpen, and I think the way it's going to go and the way Rob Thompson has played it, it's going to be whoever's the hot hand. So it just gives them an added dimension, an extra arm that they definitely need to be able to compete again, defend their National League crown. They are better overall, but obviously championships aren't won on paper. So as good as they look on paper, the Braves got better, the Mets got better. You got to watch out for the Marlins coming up. So it's definitely, they need to take care of their business now on the field. I still think they're going to have another couple of moves left in them, but overall, I like what they've done so far. Flyers are currently in the 28th spot out of 32 teams, so they're close, which basically they need to be 30th in order to have the best shot for one of those top 3 picks. Obviously, the further down they finish, the better chance they have, but they're only 5 points out of that 30th spot thanks to the Ducks winning last night over Vegas, believe it or not. And they actually play the Sharks tonight, which they could swap with them. They're currently a point up on the Sharks. So again, if you're not sure what we're talking about or you're not a regular listener, I talked a few weeks ago about the art of tanking and whether or not it's good for sports teams or good for the sport, and just alternatives to getting better if you're stuck in that purgatory, so to speak. So go back and give that a listen, but we're actively rooting, or at least I shouldn't say we. I'm actively rooting for the Flyers to tank. So I want them to go as low as they can and have the best shot to get one of those top 3 picks. Because ultimately in this draft, those top 3 players are game changers. They're going to be franchise-altering players, and you throw that with a good young goaltender who's coming into his own, and you have some pieces now as a Flyers organization to build on. There are a lot of depth in this draft. However, they all come with some question marks. Those top 3 guys are widely considered from everyone to be game changers, franchise altering players. So that's why we've been actively saying we want to get one of those top 3. Obviously, we want the top pick, but we don't necessarily want to get greedy. The Sixers, they're currently in the 5th spot, only 4 games back of the first seed. They've been hot. Maxey might be coming back this week. They are 8-2 in their last 10. Things are looking good. We want to see them continue to play this way. I'm anxious to see what they do at the trade deadline, whether Toby's here, whether they can trade him somehow to get better with some bench depth, and as well as building for the future and being able to kind of overcome that contract that they signed him to. And the way the guys off the bench have been playing, I think now more than ever, you're in a spot where you could possibly trade Tobias and get some good pieces, because those guys, due to injuries, have proven that they're able to play at a high level night after night. So we talked about this before, that as things kind of go, and those, like the injuries at first, you're like, oh man, this guy's out, or Harden's been out for a month and a half, or whatever it is. Maxey's out now, but those guys are getting some good runs with the number ones against number ones. So that's just making them better. So when they do come off the bench against the twos that aren't quite as good, they're able to do that much better. So I like where the Sixers are heading. Doc, your seat is getting a little lukewarm now, which is fine. We don't want you on the hot seat right now, but you got to prove it and continue to figure out your rotations and things like that. Eagles, tough loss last week to the Cowboys. And it's only frustrating. I'm not going to sit here and use the Dallas excuse. Oh, well, it was our backup quarterback. No, like we should have won that game. That's the frustrating part. Backup, starter, whoever, you turn the ball over 4 times, you're going to have some issues winning a game. And the fact that they were able to overcome that and still be in that game, that to me shows that they are a much better team than the Cowboys. And I know Cowboy fans don't want to hear it, but for me, it was obvious. It was plain as day. It didn't matter who the quarterback was. It didn't matter what was going on. Some boneheaded plays, and I'm not making excuses because we lost that game. And my hat's off to Dallas. Tip of the cap to you. Bigger game for you than it was for us, but I think it was obvious because leading into the game, it was quiet, and it's been relatively quiet from Dallas fans afterwards because I think they realize, shit, we're not nearly as good as we thought. Didn't come out unscathed, though. The big injury is Lane Johnson with his abdomen tear, which just sounds ridiculously painful, but he's resting, rehabbing it. Going to hold off on surgery till after the playoffs, which I love and I think could be. Remember during the 2017 run where he was one of the big guys with that underdog mask and kind of leading that mentality and getting them pumped up. I kind of see the same thing now happening where guys are going to be like, yo, listen, this guy's playing with a torn ab, putting off surgery. Let's go out there and fucking win this. So I think we're going to be all right. We've been doing a lot of Eagles stuff on the other pod I do, which is the daily one. I'm sure you've heard me talk about, if you're not a regular listener, This Day in Philly Sports History. So we've been talking just the whole Dallas week and now the week with the Saints. Just riffing basically on what's going on. So be sure to check that out wherever you get your podcasts and everything. But for today's topic, it is the anniversary of, I would say, one of the most bizarre, I guess would be the way to put it. And not even Eagles history. I mean, it definitely is the most bizarre, I feel, game in Eagles history, but possibly NFL history. And 34 years ago on this week on New Year's Eve, it was the Fog Bowl. And for those of you who don't know, it was the NFC divisional playoff in Chicago between the Eagles and the Bears. Fog started rolling in before halftime, and next thing you know, the second half, you couldn't see anything. So before we really get into the what ifs of the Fog Bowl, before we even get to 1988, we have to go back a couple years to get the full picture. Starting in 1986, Buddy Ryan took over, and he was the head coach. He had just won the Super Bowl with the Bears, created the 85 Bears defense, one of the greatest of all time. And I think what he was doing was trying to figure out what he had. He had a young Randall Cunningham at quarterback. He had an aging Ron Jaworski. He just had an overall shitty team, but a team that had some good pieces. So he was trying to figure out what was going on. I don't know if he endeared himself that well to fans or not. Or, yeah, the fans who were, especially a certain group of fans who probably were very old school. Jaworski's the man. And just, I can see him coming in and rubbing people the wrong way. And I was still a little bit too young in 86 to really see what was going on. But like I said, he's figuring out what he has going on. And then you have 1987. They were ready to take he was starting to get some of his players in there. He was getting them an identity. And that was a year that the NFLPA went on strike. And what they what he told his players was, he's like, I don't care whether you guys cross the picket line or go on strike, but he told them to stick together and he would support them either way. And the Eagles, probably in part because Philly is such a big union town, or union city, I should say, what they did was they decided to go on strike and he supported it. And the replacement players he had were, I mean, all of them were just horrible. So the league lost one game that was canceled due to the strike, and then they played three with the replacement players until the new CBA was agreed upon and put in place. So the Eagles went 0-3 with that team. Now, they went 7-8 on the season. And not bad. It was a natural progression. I believe they were 5-11 or 6-10 in Buddy's first year with the leftover crap and basically still the remnants of the Super Bowl team, along with many missed and ridiculous draft picks, which that's where I am in my book right now writing it, and it's taking forever because it's just so many wasted draft picks. But enough of that. But so they went 0-3 with their replacement players. So they went 7-8 on the season. Three of those losses came with the replacement players, and they played the Bears, Packers, and Cowboys. And if they win one of them, it puts them in the playoff discussion. And I think it's hard to believe that they wouldn't have won at least one, possibly two of those games, because the Bears were kind of floundering somewhat. They were still a solid team, but they were trying to get back. But losing Buddy Ryan was a big blow to them, I think, and they were trying to figure out offense because it was the in-between where Walter Payton was still one of the greatest of all time and getting ready to retire. Packers were not like world beaters. The Cowboys were on the decline, getting ready to be the shitty version of the Cowboys. So it's hard. Like, they would have won at least one of them, which would have had them in the discussion for the playoffs. They win two of them, they're in the playoffs. And also that season, Reggie White had 21 sacks. Wouldn't have been the record, but 21 sacks in 12 games. Remember, they lost 4 games. One that was canceled, 4 with the replacement players. So think about that for a minute. The record currently is 22.5, tied between TJ Watt and Michael Strahan. Both of them set the record in their 16th game. So think about that. Reggie had 21 in 12 games. Both years that TJ Watt and Michael Strahan got to 22.5, they did it in their last game of the season. And Strahan's was somewhat questionable with Brett Favre. So just to give you a comparison of just how dominant Reggie was that year in 12 games, in the 12th game, Strahan had 16.5, TJ Watt had 17.5. So that's a whole 4.5, 3.5, 4.5 more that Reggie had. So the team lost 25% of their season, which Reggie might have had 25, 26 sacks that year, the pace he was on. But they lost 25 of their season, which that's 4 games. And that's a lot of an NFL season because the teams need time to gel, especially with a new coach. And he had all the new players in. That was more of the transition with Randall, played majority of the snaps at quarterback. You had those guys on defense. They had drafted Jerome Brown. So they had some of the pieces that we know from those teams in place, and they lost 25% of that season where they could have gotten their shit together. And all of this, basically, I know this is about the Fog Bowl, but to say that they were on the cusp in 87 of breaking out had they not lost the 4 games due to the strike. So not only that, Buddy was starting to put his own stamp and give that team a personality. Look back at the fake spike against Dallas after the replacement or after the strike was over. He felt that Tom Landry, who was a legend in NFL, not only just Dallas, one of the most revered people ever, Tom Landry, he felt he was running up the score on him. Buddy Ryan didn't care who you were. He said, fuck you. I'm running up the score on you. And it kind of, we talked about this on this podcast with my brother when he was on. This is sort of what reignited that Dallas Eagles rivalry. And it was basically Buddy saying, I'm not taking any shit from anybody. I don't care who you are. You could be, whether it's Tom Landry, Vince Lombardi, whoever. He's like, I'm not taking shit from anybody. And that sort of carried over into his team. And to lose 25% of that season, that's huge. That's very huge. So, coming into the 1988 season, the NFC, I don't want to say it was on a down year because they were of the dominant conference during this time, but it was very much wide open. Like, usually you had your top teams. You had San Francisco, Washington, the Giants. This year, for whatever reason, it was more wide open. You had the Giants, Washington, San Francisco. The Saints were pretty decent. The Bears were always a threat. The Vikings were always a threat. The Rams were up and coming, and so were the Eagles. So I did some research and looked and wanted to track down what the preseason outlook was for the Eagles going into 88. And they were seen as an up-and-coming team that was probably a year away. Playoffs should have been in the discussion. I don't necessarily think they were Super Bowl contenders. I did see some magazines and newspaper clippings and things that I could find because I didn't want to spend too much time on it. But there were people who were calling them the dark horse. Like, if things break right or if Buddy can get this in place or can figure out that. And I tend to agree with that. And granted, I was still young, so I didn't know. Of course, they were my team. Of course, they were going to be the best. But the NFC back then was a juggernaut. So no matter what, any team in that, even if it would have been the Cardinals, those teams came out of playing in the division better for it because the division was so good. So some people can look at it as a curse that they were in the NFC East during this time, but it made them better. And they started off 1-3, and they got off to a slow start in 1988, but they also then went 3-1 in their next 4. And maybe this is a stretch, maybe this is revisionist history, maybe I'm wearing my Kelly Green colored glasses, but did the 25% of the season they missed the year before play a role in that? With the growing pains and the gelling and getting things sort of in place that a new coach typically needs some time to do. That's 4 games. They got off to that slow start. They went 3-1 in their next 4 and then went 6-2 the rest of the way. Imagine if they had those 4 games in 87, even 3 of them. I don't know. I'm just saying it's worth examining, and that's what we do here on this podcast. We ask what if. What if the strike didn't happen in 87? How does that impact? And that's not even what this whole episode is about, but how does that impact the 88 team? I think it plays a big role, especially when they start off 1-3 and then go 9-3 the rest of the way. Think about that. 1-3 and then they're 9-3 the rest of the way. Not too shabby. You give them those 4 games in 87, who the hell knows what would have happened. And ultimately, though, in 88, they won the division the last day of the season after they beat the Cowboys. And the Jets beat the Giants. It was a last-second catch. Al Toon, I'll never forget it as long as I live. Al Toon caught the ball. It was the catch heard around Philadelphia. But this was my team. This is the team for me that started it all. I've talked a lot about my love for the Buddy Ryan Eagles on this podcast, on This Day in Philly Sports History. If you see me in person, for the love of God, the book is basically started, like the idea for the book and where it took the right turn is because of the Buddy Ryan teams. That's how much these teams meant to me. But this 88 team, I feel as though is underrated. Everybody talks about the Randall Cunningham year, myself included, that he blew out his knee, that the defense was lights out as the year, they missed the opportunity. I don't know. I think 88, to be completely honest, that was the year. And it was the first year I truly watched the Eagles and paid attention to every game. And I did the year before to a certain extent, but I had my grandparents used to get all of the grandsons the Miller Lite NFL playbook and basically or handbook. It was like a little mini magazine, and honestly, if you're watching it, it was basically about this size. It was very small, and you basically open it up, and you can see them on eBay if you do just a Google search. But basically, they had little articles. It's a lot of how I learned history of the NFL and about teams. But they had the spots then where you could write in the scores for every game. So it gave me a reason to just watch the games and pay attention to the scores. And honestly, it really taught me. And as much as everybody thinks it's funny, and my wife's like, "Oh, your life revolves around this." Well, yeah, my life does sort of revolve around the Eagles because of the Eagles, it helped me with math. I'm very good with doing mental math because of copying down these scores and putting them in the handbook. Taught me geography. I learned where things are, West Coast time zones, the Mountain time zone, the Central time zone, all of that stuff. The West Coast. Never knew the West Coast had a different TV schedule until Pat Summerall said, after 60 minutes for everybody on the West Coast is murder, she wrote. So yeah, my life doesn't necessarily revolve around the Eagles. However, they play a big, big role in sort of my upbringing and how I learned certain things. And to this day, I can still kind of go through the 7 times tables and the 3 and the addition with that because of just being able to know, okay, 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, that thing. So yes, all because of the Miller Lite Handbook and the Eagles. So thank you very much. Welcome to my TED Talk. Anyway, but that 88 team, I used to write recaps, for the love of God. I would write recaps of all of those games, and I still probably have them somewhere at my parents' house. And then I remember the one that sticks out in my mind was the Clyde Simmons blocked field goal. They were playing the Giants up in the Meadowlands. It was in overtime. The Eagles were driving, and Luis Sendejas had his, and it was basically, I'll never forget it because Pat Summerall or John Madden, I forget which one, but they were talking about how most kickers kick up and kind of over, but Zendejas was a line drive kicker, and Pat Summerall was like, "Well, we'll see what happens here, John." And sure enough, if the announcer jinxed, he blocked the punt. Clyde Simmons, who was blocking on the play, picked it up and rumbled in for the end zone. Bill Parcells comes running onto the field, bitching and complaining about, "Oh, he can't advance it," and it was how I learned the rule that you can advance. And side note, I know I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but the Thanksgiving game, Dallas and Miami, I knew that Leon Lett had no business being near that ball when he hit that blocked field goal because it went past the line of scrimmage. And I learned from this game, the Clyde Simmons caught the block behind the line or picked it up behind the line of scrimmage. Therefore, he can advance it. Thank you. There's your daily NFL rule interpretation of the day. But anyway, I love those teams, and this is what sparked my love for the Eagles. This is what helped me get into season tickets and things like that. But I mean, to be honest, part of the reason I have this podcast and you're listening to me right now is because of the Buddy Ryan teams. I have my routine too. I still to this day, and it's different now with kids and having season tickets, but I'm a creature of habit. But I had a routine. We would go to Sunday school, read the Sunday paper. After I spent 15 minutes putting it back together, because my dad is definitely not a neat paper person. He's a folder and doing this. So I would always unfold everything, kind of put everything back in. And there's 2 kinds of people in the world. There's people that leave their newspaper neat when they're done. And then there's the others, like my dad. But love you, Dad. But yeah, and it didn't matter whether it was the Sunday Inquirer or the Philadelphia Daily News. I had to put it always back together when I got it after my dad. He always brought it home from work for me, and he always made sure I had both of them, but it was a pain in the ass to put them back together. And then while I was reading the paper, I would watch WWF Wrestling Challenge or Superstars of Wrestling, I forget whichever one, and then the Randall Cunningham Show, and then it was time for the NFL Today on CBS. But yeah, Hulk Hogan, Randall Cunningham, my two heroes. What a team. They could have been tag team champs if they ever teamed up. Imagine that. The power and the athleticism. Man, what a tag team. Anyway, all right, so back to the fog ball. So all of that, the Eagles were not favored in the game, but I think some people were giving them a chance because, again, the NFC was not as dominant. I should Let me take that back. It's not that it wasn't dominant. It just wasn't. You didn't have the clear cut favorite. Like the Bears were the 1 seed, so the Eagles as the 3 seed, and due to they shouldn't have played each other under today's rules, but back then the NFL didn't let division teams play each other in the playoffs until the conference championship game, whenever it was possible. I guess there would have been times where if 3 teams from a division made the playoffs, but they tried to do that. So first of all, the Eagles got screwed there. They should have been playing Minnesota, I think it was, but instead I'm sorry, not Minnesota. It would have been, maybe they didn't get screwed. They would have had to play go out to San Francisco. So maybe, I guess it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But it was New Year's Eve, which was a Saturday. The game was at 12:30, and I just remember being so excited. Like, I'm into it. They made the playoffs, and at that point, they hadn't made the playoffs since like '81. So I mean, it was a big deal, and I knew it was a big deal just from hearing my dad talk, my grandparents, my uncles, and everything. So I knew it was a big deal. So I had him record it, and I was like, I'm gonna watch this when he gets home from work. I think he was working 8 to 4 that day or 7 to 3, and I was like, I'll watch it with him when he gets home from work. This is gonna be awesome. The Eagles in the playoffs. They're gonna beat the Bears. I still have that on DVD. We went through and put a lot of the old VHS tapes on DVD. The Fog Bowl is one of the ones I have on DVD, and now actually I don't even have a DVD player, so it's on my OneDrive, and I've actually attempted to watch it multiple times over the years. I still can't make it past halftime. And I can't make it past halftime because it's so frustrating that they lost that game. In the first quarter, they're missing their chances. Like, they had 2 touchdowns called back for penalties. Holding was one. I think one might have been an offensive pass interference. Like, ridiculous things that, if nothing else, the Buddy Ryan teams were entertaining, but they were always one of the most penalized teams. So they didn't really have much discipline. And that is kind of one of those things Buddy just overlooked. He's like, who cares? And they missed a field goal. And between the penalties, the field goals, the silly things that they did, they gave up a long run. But they weren't playing bad. And you could tell that the Eagles, to me anyway, and I've watched it now as an older adult, the Eagles were the better team in the first quarter. They just made the mistakes, which typically then means you're down. So they were nervous. I'll give them that, or the butterflies, whatever you want to call it. So 10-year-old me, they're going to be fine in the second quarter. They got this. So they're still missing opportunities, but the defense started to tighten up a little bit. They kind of shut down, but penalties killed them. And it always was the case sometimes with those Buddy Ryan teams. Just like John Chaney's basketball teams, the matchup zone is great until you catch a hot shooter. And it always seemed like they lost in the tournament because somebody was a hot shooter. This is what the story was with Buddy Ryan. Buddy Ryan's teams played well, and then they'd have a stupid penalty. Or they'd get burnt deep because they had 10 guys blitzing and Isaiah Jenkins couldn't keep up with the receiver. But the fog started rolling in then with about 2-3 minutes left in the half. So when the dust settled, the Eagles were down 17-6. Not insurmountable by any stretch. Keep in mind, back then, they also did not have the 2-point conversion. So technically, this was a 2-score game, but they couldn't make up points here or there with a 2-point conversion or anything else. But considering they should have been up maybe a touchdown or less than been down less than a touchdown, or possibly leading the game like by 10. Like that's how wide of a span it was, and how many mistakes that they made. They could have been up like 10 points at halftime. I felt confident. Little did we know that the fog just never dissipated. And apparently it's not uncommon for fog to roll off of Lake Michigan like that. And they kept saying, oh, usually it comes in and then it just disappears. Well, this fog, for whatever reason, never dissipated. It was nearly impossible to see. The game was super, super sloppy. Each team got a field goal. And when it was all said and done, Randall threw for over 400 yards, but he had 3 interceptions. Due to the fog, it was it was impossible to run. And the Eagles had white uniforms on. So think about that. Like, you're playing in the fog and they were wearing their white jerseys. And the Cowboys, the Bears had their dark blue on. So it kind of was one of those like, man, what just happened? That type of deal. And nothing really happened. And that was, I think, what was devastating to me. There were so many times that the Eagles got close, or at least what appeared to be on TV got close. But the defense forced 4 turnovers. Everything was right except for the fucking fog. And until this day, I still am devastated. I was devastated as a 10-year-old. I am crushed today just talking about it. As you can probably tell, I'm going on all these rants. I'm usually much better prepared with my notes and things like that, which I have, but I'm just speaking off the cuff right now because that is the game that just, I don't know what to think about it. Like, that was the year. So, I mean, usually when we do the what ifs, they're obvious. And to me, this is just ridiculously obvious. What if the fog never came in 1988, that night in Chicago, or that afternoon in Chicago? To me, it was the perfect storm, no pun intended, for the Eagles that year. And I think because of the way the NFC was, it was the parity in the NFC, those teams were all better than most of the AFC teams. But because it was so spread out, to this day, there's no doubt in my mind that the Eagles would have won that game in the second half without any fog. And I hated it then, and I hate when people bring it up now. Well, both teams had to play in the fog. Yes, they did. But the Bears had the lead when the fog came in. They also had dark jerseys on. So they won by the exact same amount that they had before the fog came in. So that shows me nobody could do shit. And that fog doesn't come in, no doubt in my mind the Eagles come back and beat the Bears. I don't know if they beat them 31-20, 27-20, but there's no doubt in my mind they come back and win that game. Then they go to San Francisco the following week. And think about this. Because of the way the NFL rule was, they should have been going out to San Francisco for the divisional playoffs. Kind of glad the way it would have, minus the fog, the way it worked out, Chicago was an easier game than what going to San Francisco would have been. And here's the deal. I've played, and I don't know if you guys ever have seen this website. If you have or you haven't, I mean, check it out. It's actually kind of fun. I think because of how much that they play a role in my podcast research and my book research, I'm going to reach out to them. Maybe they can be a sponsor, but whatifsports.com. And basically, you can put in any team from any era and they play the game out. Basically, a computer simulation. And I've done this so many times. The Eagles going out to San Francisco. And every time I've done it, it's never more than 6. If you do it for 10 games, it's never more than 6-4 either way. To me, that tells me that those two teams were evenly matched, and the Eagles were more than live to win that game if they went out to San Francisco. The Bears got blown out, by the way. So, what if sports doesn't necessarily take into consideration is what I think gives the Eagles the edge if they go out to San Francisco. It doesn't take into account the fact that the team is starting to gel and they would have been rolling. The defense is coming into its own and they were hot ending the regular season. They don't take that 1-3 start out of the equation and see that they were 9-3 the rest of the way. They take the whole picture. So they don't take the intangibles, and I don't think it's a close game, to be completely honest. And yeah, back then, to me, Montana was the GOAT. Like, he was the greatest clutch person ever. And until Tom Brady came along, and I'll give it to Brady, but I don't think Montana would have had a shot. That I think they were coming in. Buddy Ryan would have had them fired up. I mean, even going into the Chicago game, he had the team's buses as they were pulling up take laps and beep the horn. Like, they were ready. And the fucking fog would have done it. So now you go to the Super Bowl. And they would have played Cincinnati. And it wasn't the best matchup for them. And even on What If Sports, it was 66% of the time the Bengals win. But it was never a blowout. And again, I think what it fails to take into consideration is the intangibles. The NFC was the dominant conference then. They had won 7 of the previous 8 Super Bowls, and when it was all said and done, they would win 15 out of 16, including 13 in a row. So basically what that tells me is you put an NFC team, especially one that plays in the NFC East, in the Super Bowl, they're winning. And it would have been tougher, but I think it's similar to the 49ers. That they're rolling now at this point. You put that team, Buddy Ryan, back in the Super Bowl 3 years later, that he would have had that team so fired up. And I think there's no way in hell they don't win the Super Bowl, all because of that fucking fog in Chicago. And truthfully, players on that team from the whole entire Buddy Ryan time until after the Jerome Brown died in 92 when Reggie left. So many players from that team, Seth Joyner, Clyde Simmons, Eric Allen, I've heard Reggie say it. Those guys all said that was the team that would have won the Super Bowl. Not the 91 team, not the 92 or the 88, or I'm sorry, the 89 or the 90. No, the 88 Eagles, they were the team that would have won the Super Bowl. And it was their best chance. And like I said, it was the perfect storm. And win or lose, even if they make it to the Super Bowl and they lose, or even if they'd won the Fog Bowl and lost in San Francisco, it maybe has a little bit less of an impact. But going to the Super Bowl, winning or losing, it impacts that team. They're young and it changes the whole trajectory. Now, knowing just sort of how things played out, I have the benefit of hindsight here. It could have gone one of two ways. They may have won another, maybe even multiple Super Bowls. Chances are they would have just kept getting better, and they were a cocky team. So throw the fact that you're a Super Bowl contender or a Super Bowl winner, and that cockiness is going through the roof, which means it totally could have imploded on them. But I just feel like the way those guys, there was enough personality that would have offset some of that. Reggie White wasn't cocky. Reggie White wouldn't let those guys get too far out of line, which is why I think if that fog didn't come in, it totally changes the whole perception and trajectory of this team. And I don't think, because I don't know, like, even though they're cocky, I don't think it would have imploded, because it doesn't matter how cocky, because they were just set up to be successful. I don't think there's any chance Buddy Ryan then gets fired. I think all of a sudden maybe they start drafting better. Or maybe once they get into free agency, maybe Buddy Ryan's still there and people want to come play for Buddy, and all of a sudden you don't have the Rich Kotite experience. Or maybe Rich Kotite goes and still coaches the Jets, and you never know. There's just so many different things. And I've talked on here too about the butterfly effect, and there's just so many rabbit holes you can go down. But man, all because of that fog, so much happen. And most importantly, it changes the whole mindset of the city. No longer Loserdelphia. And it basically, I don't know. Like, everybody just thought, oh, we get here, and then we're just not quite good enough. All of a sudden, you're not that far removed. You're only 5 years removed from the Sixers winning the NBA championship. All of a sudden, you throw that in there, and then you have the Phillies making the 93 run, the Flyer, and like all of a sudden, it's the whole mindset of the city changes. Like, I'm sorry, like it just kind of snowballed for Philly teams, and but it had to get foggy in Chicago. As I mentioned earlier, based on what I've experienced, the 91 team talent-wise was probably a better team top to bottom. And that's even after Randall Cunningham got hurt. But this stings to me more because this was the year. It was set up. It was laid out perfectly. The players said it. All of this. And honestly, this was the worst Eagles loss to me, with the exception of, or until the Tampa Bay NFC Championship loss, the last game at the Vet. And to be completely honest, this game set the tone for me as a young Philly fan. Like, I was devastated. I'm like super excited to watch this game on VHS with my dad, and there's nothing to watch. Why my dad? I'm so glad that he did. So, Dad, if you're listening, thank you for keeping that. The fact that I have the original game film, I guess you could call it, of the Fog Bowl is pretty cool. I should probably watch it just to see the commercials, if nothing less. But it kind of set the tone where I was set up then to always expect the other shoe to drop. And we've talked a lot about the fans in Philly and everything, and that's where it comes from. Like, you're set up to beat the number 1 seed Chicago Bears. They played better in that first half, even though they were losing. And then the fog comes in. It's totally like Lucy pulling the football from Charlie Brown. Every time we still go for it, knowing that the ball is going to be removed. I've talked about this, but this is new Philly now, so we don't have that mentality, and it's going to work out this year for this version of the Eagles. But it's the anniversary, 34 years ago on Saturday, that the most bizarre and just outrageous loss in Eagles history, the Fog Bowl, happened. And who knows what would have happened if that fog didn't come in. But for my money, they would have went on to win the Super Bowl. Be sure to let me know what you think. Am I drinking the Kelly Green Kool-Aid? I definitely went longer today than what I normally do because all of the memories and emotions came piling up. So am I too emotional about this? Did they have a shot the next week to beat San Francisco? Would they even have beaten Chicago in the second half? Let me know on TikTok, Twitter. Follow the YouTube channel, Jimbo_Mont. Check me out on Instagram, Philly Jimbo. Be sure to follow Back to the Future wherever you get your podcasts as we go into the new year so you can check out the new things. Be sure to also check out This Day in Philly Sports History if you like a much shorter, condensed version of this where I'm just strictly going with the facts and giving you what happened this day in Philly sports history. Have a happy, safe new year. I hope everyone has big plans for 2023. I know I do. I know with the podcast, the sky's the limit for us. So be ready for a lot of good things. Eagles are going to win the Super Bowl, which I hope does a lot of good traffic for this podcast. But go have yourselves a week. Happy New Year. And until next time, I'll see you when I see you.